Thanks, Christina, and Battery 2030 Plus board committee to give me the opportunity to present the results of the Instabat project. I'm Olivier Recure, and I'm the coordinator of the project. And now, it's a slide. I give you an outlook of the presentation. First, I give you a brief introduction of the project, the general objective, and expected out consortium on the methodologies that we use during the project. In the second part of the presentation, I give you the main results of the project in the different aspects, such as the physical sensor development and virtual development, sensor development, the smart cell integration of the sensors, and the key parameter monitoring of hygiene and safety study. And then we finish by the lab on cell concept, the core of the project, the multi-sensor platform integration. And then, of course, we conclude the presentation and give some perspective of these works. Instabat project is one of the 3 projects dedicated to the sensing part of the Battery 2030 Plus initiative. And the goal of the project is to achieve the roadmap, the objective of the roadmap for the integration of smart functionality and sensing. And there is 2 other projects on these topics, is the Instabat and the Spartacus project. Okay, what is the general objective of the Instabat project? As I said before, we try to achieve the goal of the roadmaps, and for that, in the projects, we want to develop a lab on cell concept based on the using physical and virtual sensors inside the cell to monitor the internal parameters of the cell. We focus our work in the user case such as cycling at extreme condition and high power charging for EV application. And by monitoring some of key parameters of the cells such as temperature, pressure, strength, lithium ion concentration, CO2 concentration, and so on. By monitoring these parameters, we expect to improve the knowledge of the cell. We also expect to improve the correlation between the degradation phenomenon and the signal from the sensor to improve the safety, the performances, and to integrate some new function into the battery management system to improve this aspect of the batteries, such as performances and safety. And of course, there is an impact to the cell performance, cell safety, but not only for that, but also for the second life, and of course, to connect with the other topics of the Battery 2030 Plus roadmap, such as self-healing and big data for development of new technologies. About the consortium of the project is on the map. You can show there is 8 partners. The project is coordinated by CEA. We are industrial partners such as Forvia, BMW, Infineon, and Varta, and some research centers such as CNRS, INSA Lyon, and University of Aveiro. The project was started in September 2020 for 3 years, but with an extension of 4 months. Now, I give you the main results of the project. The first part is dedicated to the development of physical sensors. The second part to the development of cell modeling on the virtual sensors. The third part is about the integration of multi-sensor into the cells to monitor the internal parameters and perform the aging and safety study. And at the end, we talk about the prototype of lab-on-cell platform. About the physical sensor development. In the project, we developed different kind of sensors. The first type was based on the optical fiber. We have 2 types of these sensors. The first one is based on the FBG sensors. The second one is based on the new type of sensor based on the luminescence materials to monitor the internal temperatures of the cell. And the second one based also on the luminescence material based to monitor the lithium ion concentration. We was working on the reference electrode sensors on the CO2 sensor, photoacoustic sensors. You can show here which partner was involved in each part of the development of these sensors. And the parameters that we measure with this with each sensors. Now I show you some results about FBG sensors. During the project, we developed a new kind of FBG sensor based on the panda fibers. Panda fibers have structures with two core part inside the fibers, and when we put the FBG sensor in this kind of fibers, we obtain a double peak for each FBG sensors. And this type of sensor can monitor the temperature and the pressure or strain, because the temperature on the strain affect the position of the peak and the relative position of the double peaks differently. And we can show here the result from calibration of this kind of sensors, where we can manage the variation of the temperature with the same displacement, and with the same temperature, we can also monitor the displacement. And we perform this sensor with a very good accuracy in terms of temperature, 0.5 degrees on 27 micro here for the displacement. And another kind of sensor developing during the project is a hybrid sensor, because we add into the FBG's sensors a fabric cavity to monitor the pressure with the same time of monitoring the temperature. With this kind of sensor, we can measure in the same time the pressure and the temperature. The cavity, the fabric cavity, give some wavelet in the signal, and the shape of the wavelet depending on the pressure applied on this cavity. And the temperature was monitored by the FBG peak, you can see here. And in the same way as the previous sensor, we can decorrelate the two signals, and there with accuracy of 0.6 degree and 8 millibar for the pressure. Another kind of sensor developing with optical fiber is a luminescence sensor based of optical material to monitor the temperatures. During the project, we work on the selecting luminescence materials with a good property, and put this material at the end of the fiber to develop the sensor himself. And we also test the sensor into the cell. You can show here the integration of the optical fiber into the pouch shell. And we validate the calibration of the sensor. It's a good opportunity for me to explain what it works. The signal from the sensor come from the optical materials, gives two peaks in the spectrum. One peaks remain constant with the temperature, and the second one decrease with the temperature. And by monitoring the ratio between the two intensity, we have a linear relation between the logarithm of this ratio with the inverse of temperature. And by measuring the luminescence signal, we can monitor the temperature inside the cell. It's what we show in this graph, where we test the cell in a 2C charge on 4C discharge cycling. And you can show here the variation of the intensity of the peak 1 during this cycling, and we observe that the intensity decreases when the temperature increases. And if you apply the calibration curves, you can access to the internal temperature of the cell. And if you compare this internal temperature in green to the surface temperature measuring by the thermocouple, there is a very good correlation of the signal between the both measurement of the temperature. And this result validates the behavior of the sensors, and the sensors work very well inside the cell without any modification. I don't show here the result, but any modification of the performances of the cell in terms of electrochemistry. Another kind of sensor based on luminescence I presented before is to monitor the lithium ion concentration. For that, we need to choose the optical probe. In the literature, there is a lot of molecules are able to catch lithium in a liquid medium and to have a modification of the optical properties. And we are analyzes these literatures, and there is here a good review on that to find the best molecules. But there is some differences because there is no molecules was previously developed for the working in electrolyte, and it is a very particular medium because we are in the carbonate solvent. And the work performed during the project is to adapt this molecule to working into this medium. And you can show here a result that we have the variation of the signal from the optical probe depending on the concentration of lithium, and you can show here the variation. And if we plot the variation of the intensity as function of the concentration of lithium into the electrolyte, there is a good variation of the signal, and we can by this way measure the concentration of the lithium into the electrolyte. But this probe is only a molecule. We need to attach this molecule into the fiber. For that, we need to attach this molecule into the polymer. We use the PVA polymer. The intermediate step is to check if the probe after the graphing to the polymer work well. And you can show here the result, the same experiment. We monitor the variation of the concentration as function of with this probe, but with a PVA function. And in this case, there is an increase of the signal, not a decrease. It's an inverse behavior, but it's due to the interaction between the PVA and the molecule related to the luminescence. But the conclusion is it's work because we can monitor the concentration by the variation of the signal of luminescence. And then to validate that, we graph the molecule, the probe, into the glass surfaces. It's not optical fibers, but it's glass surfaces to check if after the graphing, the covalent graph of this probe to the glasses, we maintain the function of the variation of the luminescence as function of the concentration of lithium ion, and its work. We test it into the electrolyte, the same electrolyte. But when we try to craft this molecule at the end of the optical fiber, we see the signal, but the signal is very low, and it's not possible to use the sensor to monitor the lithium into the electrolyte at this time due to the low signal and the very low due to the very low signal, there is a lot of noise, and it's not possible to monitor precisely the concentration of lithium with the sensor actually. But it's not a huge difficulty to increase the number of probes at the end of the fiber, but it is a way that we want to achieve, but it's not in the frame of the Instabat project because the project is already finished. But for the future development of this sensor, we identified some strategy to increase the signal, but we are validate that this sensor can be worked into the electrolyte and inside the cell. Now I show you the result from the reference electrode sensor. the reference electrode sensor was developed to be integrated into the cell with a very small dimension to limit the perturbation from this sensor to the electrochemistry. For that, we decide to deposit the reference electrode into the separators. For that, we use gold deposition for the electric conduction, and in one of the part of this shape, we deposit the LFP as the active material for the reference electrode. You can show here an integration of this reference electrode into the pouch shell, and we check that the presence of electrode reference don't affect the electrochemistry performances of the cell. And then we check the behavior of this sensor in different C rate. And you can show here a comparison between the cell without reference electrode on the cell with reference electrode. We show that the potential curves remain exactly similar, and we can access by this way to the potential of the negative electrode and the positive electrode. And for example, in this case, at the 8C rate, we show that the negative potential go below 0 volt versus lithium, and it is a risk area for the lithium plating. With this kind of information, we can manage different information about the aging or the risk of degradation mechanisms into the cell. For example, we can determine what is the critical C rate for the SOH to limiting the risk of lithium plating, and we can also access to the potential of each electrodes compared to the potential of the cell, and by this way to monitor the variation of this potential, we can access to different loads of active material at the positive side, negative side, and of the lithium inventory. And we use this kind of sensor during the aging test to monitor all these parameters. The last sensor, physical sensor, is a CO2 sensor. During the project, we start with the CO2 sensor from Infineon. During the project, this sensor is relatively big compared to an insertion to reduce the size by using only the active area to put inside the cell, and to separate the electronic PCB to the sensor himself. We tested the sensor into the argon atmosphere because this sensor is initially developed by Infineon for measuring the CO2 into the air, not in argon atmosphere or in electrolyte atmosphere. And it's working well, but we need to change the calibration coefficient to measure the CO2 concentration. Then we are testing the sensor into the pouch shell by managing this kind of experiment, where we use a pouch shell with a small hole on the sensor just behind the cell. All this part was closed in the new pouch shell, and we perform some cycling. During the cycling, we show there is a lot of variation of the signal from the sensor, and it's correlated to the cycling, but it's not correlated to the CO2 measurement, because there is no reason to have CO2 emission during this cycling in this case, and the concentration measurement is very, very high. And there is a lot of question after this experiment, and we explore in more detail what's happened with the sensor, and we identify that the sensor was based on the absorption of the gaze, the absorption peak in infrared area of the CO2, but this absorption is at the same wavelength than the infrared peaks from the electrolyte components, such as the carbonate. And it's why we don't measure the CO2 in this case, but we probably measure other things. And there is a lot interferences between CO2 and the other gases inside the cell, and it's not possible for this sensor to measure the CO2 only. We identified during the project some solution for that, but it's not possible to implement it that during the project. In this table, I give you an overview of the result from each sensor with the accuracy and also with the TRL that we achieve during the project. We show that for the major part of the sensor, we achieve a good results and with a good TRL, but for the lithium sensor and the CO2 sensor, the achievement is not sufficient to be used in the battery at this time, and we need to have more effort in research for this kind of sensors. And now I give you an overview of the virtual sensor. For that, we develop some physical model of the cell with electrochemistry parameters on the thermal model. The physical model was based on a Newman model. And after that, after the validation of this model, we use a model reduction to prepare the virtual sensors to have a very small model to be useful in a real-time environment, and then we integrate this virtual sensor to the BMS to improve the SOX algorithms. It is a step for the development of this part, and we expect it with this. It's not unexpected, but the objective is to develop the sensor to measure the internal parameter distribution inside the cell, the local electrode potential, and the local lithium ion concentration. In this slide, I give you just an example of the real-time virtual sensor observer estimation. You can show some of parameters. I don't explain in detail all these parameters, but there is a film. You can, I hope I can start the film. Yeah. You can show in real time the result from the virtual sensor to monitor some parameters, the internal parameters of the cell. With the potential and current of the cell, we can access to the lithium concentration inside the cell, in the electrolyte, and also some parameters, of each electrodes that we use to establish a good SOX into the BMS. Now, I give you some results about the parameter monitoring, aging, and safety study. In this part of the project, we use different kind of cell. I already show you the monolayer cell with water electrodes, the stacked cell with a 1 ampere hour with a water electrode, but we also use commercial cell from Lifun with a NMC622 graphite with the same electrolyte for each cell that we use. We are some results about the testing reference electrodes, the FBG sensor and luminescence sensor for the temperatures. But I don't show you the result from the CO2 and the lithium ion concentration because this sensor was not tested inside the cell due to the behavior. Now I give you a first results. It's not on the pouch shell, but it's on a commercial cylindrical cell. We put the hybrid sensor Panda fibers with FBG to monitor the temperatures and the strain related to the pressure. And we compare the result inside the cell and outside the cell. And we are validate that the sensor are able to monitor in the same time the variation of temperature and the variation of the delta epsilon inside the cell. You can show the result in this publication for each part. I give you the reference of the publication. Another work is with the same kind of FBG sensor to monitor simultaneously the thermal behavior of the cell during cycling and the displacement or the mechanical properties of the casing. And we can access to the map of this parameter into the cycling simultaneously, in this case with three sensors along the cells. Another results, but I don't show you the results. We perform also some tests with a hybrid sensor to monitor internally the temperature and the pressure of the cell, but the publication was not test now, but there is the result can be shown in the thesis of Mr. Freitas. Was defined in 2022. With FBG, we can also access to the thermal behavior of the cell. In this result, we are using FBG inside and outside the cell to monitor the temperature during the formation cycle. And we can study the impact of the electrolyte to the thermal behavior during the formation. By access to this information, we can correlate this information to the quality of the SRI. And you can take a look at the result in this publication from the CNRS Collège de France. Another result that I want to show you is about the aging. We use an internal FPG sensor to monitor the temperature of the cell inside and outside the cell during cycling. In this test, we use a Li-Fun cell with a cycling test with WLTP. You can show here the different WLTP cycling, a long-term cycling, and then there is a checkup to measure the capacity of the cell at HC rate. And you can show in this graph the internal, external temperature of the cell. We observe that the degradation of the cell are very similar for the cell with and without the sensor inside. But after more of 30 or 30 or 40, 350 cycling, there is a slightly differences when we test the cell at 25 degrees. But at 55 degrees, there is a huge effect of the presence of the sensor to the degradation because the cell with the optical fiber decrease very quickly in terms of capacity during aging. I give you another example of the aging study. In this example, it is an aging study of the monolayer cell, but with reference electrode. We test the cell at different temperature, -10, 25, 45 degrees, and we compare the cell with and without the sensor. During the cycling, we perform the WLTP, and between each series of WLTP, we have a checkup cycling at a low C rate to measure the capacity of the cell and to access also to the potential of each electrodes and analyze the degradation by using the potential of the negative and the positive electrode. We can access to the loss of active material at the positive side, negative side, and the loss of lithium. The results show in this graph is a comparison between the SOH of the cell as function of temperature with and without the sensors inside, and we show that the behavior are relatively similar. There is no major effect of the sensor to the degradation of the cell, but we show also the degradation are very impacted by the temperature, because when the temperature go at 0 degree or -10 degrees, the degradation is very high. In this type of cell, we show that the aging at 45 degrees is less than the 25 degrees. And we can analyze by using the reference electrodes, the loss of active material at positive, negative side, on the loss of active lithium material, lithium inventory, sorry. And we show a difference between the behavior at 0 degree and 45 degree. For example, at 0 degrees, there is a lot of loss of lithium inventory during aging, but also a lot of loss of active material at the negative side. It is purple curves. But at 45 degrees, the degradation is driven essentially by the loss of active lithium inventory. not for the loss of active material at the positive and negative side. Another example of aging study is shown here with optical fibers, luminescence of optical fiber to monitor the internal temperature. In this case, we use 1 ampere-hour cells. We perform the same test at -10, 25, and 45 degrees. And we compare the degradation rate with instrumented cells on the reference cell without the sensor inside. You can show here the results, and there is a similar behavior of the cell with and without the sensor, and we show the same results that the sensor at -10 degrees decreased very quickly, and at 25 degrees and 45 degrees, the degradation rates are very similar. But we can access with this sensor to the internal temperature of the cell. I show you only results of the measurement of the temperature increase during the checkup when we perform 4C discharge at AC rate, and we can measure the temperature inside the cell and outside the cell, and we show differences because inside the cell the temperature increases a little bit more than outside the cell, and we show the impact of the aging of the cell to the variation of this temperature. And this information is useful to understand the mechanisms of the degradation. Another result is the long-term study on the impact of the presence of the sensor inside the cell. I show you here the result from the 150 cycling with a WLTP with 1 ampere-hour cell with FOTL sensors. You can show here the beginning of the cycling. We show the signal from the sensor in blue is very correlated to the variation of the temperature of the cell, measuring outside the cell in the surface of the cell by using thermocouple, and the end of the cycling. And we show after the cycling the optical sensor working well and fit the variation of the temperature very well. And it's a proof that the sensor is stable over all the tests. And if you open the cell, now I show you one of the results of the project is the impact of the sensor to the degradation of the cell himself. We show that there is no difference in the global performances of the cell between instrumented cell and non-instrumented cell, but when we take a look in detail, we can show there is an impact locally into the electrode. You can show here the result of the post-mortem analysis after 200 cycling of the test performing at 25 degrees, and we show around the fibers some of lithium plating, and we can explain this phenomenon by the dimension of the optical fiber, because the dimension is very big, 250 micrometer for the diameter of the fiber compared to the size of the electrode. It's a few microns for the thickness of each electrode, and there is a huge impact due to the space here. But this impact is not visible at the global performances of the cell. It's very locally, but there is some question about how we can limiting this effect. One solution is to reduce the diameter of the fiber, because, for example, for the FBG fiber, we don't show this phenomenon, but the diameter is less than the FOTL sensors, is around 100 micrometers. Now I talk about the abuse test. We perform some abuse test with multi-sensor cells. It is a Varta cell of 1.1 ampere hours, where we put inside a reference electron on FOTL, the optical fiber with luminescence material for measuring the temperatures. We show here the cells that we prepare. We also include into the platform all the function. all the measurement of each parameters and monitoring the parameter of the cell during the test. And we perform two type of tests, but at a very few number of cells, because during the project it's very difficult to prepare a lot of cells. We are only testing one cell with a sensor inside in overcharge, and one cell with sensor inside at overheating testing. And we compare this result to the cell without sensors. What we show that the behavior of the cell with the sensor is better than the cell without sensor, because, for example, in this case, the black curves is for the reference cell without sensor, and the red curve is for the cell with the sensor. We show that the critical point during the overcharge appears after the reference cell, and there is the same temperature increase, but at the maximum point, but with a low rate. You can show here the signal from the optical fiber sensors for the internal temperature is very correlated to the external temperature measuring with the thermocouple. And we are also an information about the stability of the optical sensor up to 140 degrees around. It's in this test. It's the same kind of result for the overheating test, because for the instrumented cell, we show that the swelling of the cell during the test, there is a production of gases. And for the cell without sensor, there is a lot of gases inside the cell. But with the sensor, the gas was not so important inside the cell. And we suppose there is a micro how to say that? There is a leakage. Probably there is a leakage of the gas due to the micro opening, probably around the sensor into the pouch shell. But the conclusion is we don't show a major impact of the presence of sensor to the safety behavior of the cell, but there is very few experiments, and we need to reproduce this experiment to have a good conclusion about that. Now it's the final part of the presentation is about the lab-on-cell concept and the prototype for the lab-on-cell platform. We use a cell with multi-instrumented with a different kind of sensors, and we developed during the project a multi-sensor platform based on LabVIEW environment on PXI computer architecture. This platform is able to collect all the data from the sensor to perform the processing of the data, and also to integrate the algorithms on the virtual sensors to simulate the BMS with the SOX indicator. Of course, this platform is able to collect the data and interface the data to the database. For example, if we want to collect all the data and perform some analysis or some other development. For the proof of concept, the first results that I want to show you is we validate the virtual sensor integration into the platform. For example, here is for the eBase virtual sensor compared to the modelization performing to the MATLAB. You can show here the result from the LabVIEW implementation. And then we use some offline validation of the result by using that experimental data measuring during the experiment, other experiment, to validate the offline, the real-time calculation of the virtual sensors on the SOX estimation and so on. And then we perform some experiment to show, you can show here the interface of this platform We can show in the real time the SOC estimation, the temperature, some EBS prediction, and so on. And we perform during the project some tests with multi-instrumented cells. And you can show here one of the results that we have during the WLTP cycling. We can monitor in real time different parameters such as the cell voltage, current, tension, the temperatures of the cell inside, outside, but also the SOC indicators measured by or estimate from the signal of all the sensor in real time with this platform. And this result is a demonstration of the behavior of this platform. We have validated that the multi-sensor platform with operando monitoring is working with physical and virtual sensors and real-time SOX indicators. We have performed some first test at 8 CRH in charge and discharge, and all the functions are operational. But we perform only a few tests with few samples, and we need more experiment to validate the benefits of the platform related to the objective of the project, to limiting, for example, degradation mechanisms, and to improve the SOH parameters and so on. Now it's time to conclude. For the Instabat project achievement, we are developing new sensor technology, physical virtual sensors. We integrate the sensor inside the cell, and we are performing multi-instrumented cells for in situ operando monitoring. We are developing a multi-sensor platform. We are improve the SOX indicator for the BMS. We also perform aging tests on instrumented cells, and we correlate the signal from the sensor to the degradation phenomenon. And at the end of the project, we have demonstrated that proof of concept of lab-on cell platform. It's working, and we are performing some safety study, and we show some impact of the sensor to the aging of the cell. But we also perform LCA analysis and recycling analysis during the project, but I don't present the results today. But there is a lot of perspective of the project. I give you some of one. I think the result from the project for me is for the future, we need to improve the sensor integration process to limiting the impact of the sensor to the cell himself, and to improve also the quality of the smart cells, because it's not an easy task to do. We need to explore other solutions for the gas sensors, because or improve the technologies that we test during the project, because it's not possible. We are sure there is a interferences between the signal on the component of the cell himself to the detection of the gases in this case of technology. But if you want to go further into the development, we need to test more sample in aging and safety to have a more robust results on this side. And we also need to perform more tests with the multi-sensor platform for a full proof of concept of this technology. But I can say we are on track with the Battery 2030 Plus roadmap objective, but we show there is a lot of challenge to achieve all the roadmap's goals. To finish, I would like to thank all the partners of the project, of course, Battery 2030 Plus initiative, and the European Commission for the funding. And there is the link to the website, and thank you for your attention.